Welcome to the Funnel Reboot Podcast with your host, Glenn Schmeltzley. Let's get into today's show.
I'm just going to come out and say it. You ought to listen to today's podcast guest. In fact, of all the marketers who know him, 98.3% say he's positively impacted their careers. Oh, okay. That statistic was totally fabricated. But did you notice how my words just made you feel? Such phrases can activate emotions and influence people more than they like to admit. We as consumers do a lot of things just because the people around us are doing them. For proof, look no further than historical examples. From the 17th century tulip bulb craze in Holland to doomsday cults and prepper movements in the lead up to Y2K. Fads such as buying pet rocks, fidget spinners, Beanie Babies, and NFTs all show how easily prevailing thought influences individual behavior. The science behind this is well understood. The evolutionary drive to fit in with our peers is really strong. When a group of people's purchases are plotted out as a histogram, we always see the majority of them clumped near the center. We see it so often we came up with a term for it, the bell curve. So even when people think they are expressing themselves, showing individuality by their brand choices, they're only veering slightly away from the norm. Hey, Glenn here. Welcome to Funnel Reboot. Our guest today, who I really do think has positively impacted marketers' careers, argues that marketers are just as susceptible to conformity as consumers are. We get caught up in prevailing marketing practices when doing our job, while ignoring better marketing options out there. That is a recipe for mediocre results. Our guest is the author of 3 marketing books and the co-founder of an 8-year-old digital agency, Disco Sloth, that has attracted clients whose annual spend ranges from thousands to millions of dollars. What does he credit for this marketing success? The time he spent on the edges of the bell curve, doing things that most of us view as too far outside of our comfort zone. And he says to be a better marketer, you too should reject the orthodoxy of conventional marketing. Unorthodox is the name of his latest book, and I'm glad to welcome back for a second time, Gil Gildner. Gil Gildner, welcome back to the show.
Good to be here.
Thanks, man. So
Yeah.
You were on a while back and we had reviewed a book that you had written about being a digital marketer, becoming a digital marketer, and we're here to talk about a different book. What's the name of the book?
The name of the book is Unorthodoxy. And it's
Right.
the subtitle is Contrarian Marketer's Philosophy for Surviving the Dying Internet.
Okay, well, we can go in lots of places there, but I think people have a general idea of the tone we have. So, let's maybe talk about one of the things that kind of gives you that pessimistic view of the internet. And even the word, orthodoxy itself kind of speaks to it. Even something as amazing as the internet, which began, as you say, in the halls of academia, small, labs and people that are trying to be witty on a Usenet group or, sharing inside stories, maybe actually pushing ahead the boundaries of human knowledge. Those days gave way to days of everybody being on the internet and simple law of large numbers, mainstream homogenization, right? It kind of all just has come down to that, kind of like how top 40 radio, radio started off as a
good analog,
high-minded art form, right? And now it's all just like traffic weather and, the occasional earworm. I mean, we can just sit there and say that, all right, that's just the way things are. But you try to point out, we don't have to stay in that homogenized mainstream if we just move ourselves just a teeny bit outside of it. Tell me what you mean by that.
to rewind a little bit to what I meant by the dying internet, it is a pessimistic, kind of like you said. That is a very pessimistic initial take. It's like the internet's dying. The thing my whole career has been working around is dead or dying. And that's probably a little bit of an exaggeration, right? But, I actually think for anyone who's over the age of 30 or 35, you can just look at 10 or 20 years of being on the internet, and it's undeniable it's changed drastically. And I'm not just talking about technically, but the feel of it. The people doing things on the internet, the culture of the internet has totally changed. And even though it's pessimistic to say it's dying, you can actually revive it a little bit, or you can revive your own corner of it. You just have to kind of take a little bit different slant. That's kind of my approach to it. If you follow the mainstream and do exactly what everybody else on the internet is doing, we're all dead. But I think there's a way to kind of fix that.
Great point. So if we don't make a concerted effort to move against that, we're just going to slide into it. You say, and I thought this was a really interesting observation, that you found yourself doing it, right? Kind of, person, kind of, middle of the, demographic bell curve, yourself, you're the southern part of the United States, you're in a small business. So there's kind of that, Gil fits like a 38 regular. He kind of resembles, right?
How did you know?
But on the inside, you say, I realized I was as susceptible to groupthink as anyone else. It just happened that my group was a little smaller. And then you said, it took a while to realize that thinking differently is actually just self-awareness. So I think that's the key, is not, and you do rail against people who are just trying to be different for different sake, but we kind of fall into this non-playing character person if we don't actually work to become self-aware, to go, oh, I see this happening to myself. Why is that, and what can I do to avert it?
And a lot of this is just maybe, psychology that I have no idea about, and maybe no one else does either. But in terms of the internet or marketing or just communication with other people in this day and age, I think something that makes us even more susceptible to groupthink is kind of the centralization of the social media platforms. And just in the fact that the way they're set up, they reward putting stuff out there that people like. And of course, you're going to put stuff out there that becomes formulaic because it's proven to get clicks, right? So then you just get locked in a doom loop where you're just, you go on LinkedIn and you have someone posting the same spaced out, weird, semi-inspirational, tutorial on Google Ads.
Yes.
But you see that every day. And the reason is people do that because that format gets engagement. There's engagement pods out there that just churn through it. But then you do that enough people do it, it reinforces itself, and you're in the middle of that groupthink, and there is nothing creative, nothing different. You're just churning out the same stuff. And I think that plays out just on a huge scale, whether it's, grandmothers on Facebook in a knitting group or, a few Google Ads people over on LinkedIn or X or, TikTok or wherever. But how you break out of that, that's a kind of a psychology that I'm not sure anyone has the answer for.
You've given some, I think, good clues or good areas that, avenues of inquiry. So, for example, as a marketer, we are seeing, compared to, let's say, 15, 20 years ago, that things that obviously were rock solid growth strategies aren't working anymore. You point the finger at saying, well, things have just gotten too competitive. Back when there was a relatively small number of people doing it, then of course it stood out. But how does it stand out when everybody's doing it? I think scale, I think you've put your finger on it right when you've said that it is that quest for scale, that idea that
Mhm.
all impressions are equal. Therefore, I want the largest number of impressions possible.
Right.
And if we fall into that trap, we're contributing to the problem, right?
Mhm.
Somebody who was in design once said to me, if you want everything on a page to be prominent, nothing is prominent.
Right. Right.
So you say you have to unscale. You got to find an edge that isn't easy. You have to make sure that you don't get clumped at the bottom of the curve
Mhm.
with all of those standard tactics.
Yeah. And that's honestly, that's just looking at something, becoming self-aware, kind of like you pointed out earlier, and then just thinking like, okay, what's something a little bit harder that nobody else feels like they can or want to do, and I'll just do that. It's a little different, a little hard. It's probably risky, but at this point, when you have 8 billion other people, you have to do something a little risky. You have to at least find something weird enough that nobody else wants to do it or knows about it at all. And, for a while, like I think I mentioned in the book, the book The Long Tail, that was really popular
Right.
in the early
Yeah.
2000s, and it's an excellent book. It worked. That book worked for about 10 years
Yeah.
because we were catching up to the long tail. But by the time like mid aughts rolled around, like
Right.
all of the long tails had been captured. People were pretty much had slammed into every niche. Like it was, I was working in the late 2000s with people that they could just come up with the silliest idea and make $1 million on the internet somehow. They could sell little parts for like
Yeah.
toy cars and be the only person in the world doing that and sell $1 million of these little axles. But now, you've got 10 factories in China who are all doing the same thing. That scale is just overwhelmed. So you have to find such a bizarre little corner of the world that nobody else has found yet and be okay with not scaling, yeah, I think that's either that or you do something just so hard that, the handful of factories in China cannot do it because it's so hard.
Let's explore this because I think ordinary business books say, you have to be bold, you have to be a leader. I mean, there's libraries filled with that kind of tripe. I mean, you're not disagreeing with it. You are saying that, you need to do new things. You talk about people like Peter Thiel. You talk about immigrant entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. You do point out that the grain of truth is that those people either have different backgrounds or they take a longer time horizon than the norm,
Yeah.
delayed gratification. You point out these things, but you used a word that seriously challenged my thoughts at how I would adopt some of their thinking.
Interesting.
And that was, you said you've got to be ready to reckon with the label of heretic.
Okay. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because let's be honest, we're not immune from that same
Mm-hmm.
mediocrity, middle of the bell curve
Mm-hmm.
thing, even when we're marketing to other people and we're pointing at them and going, haha, they're all, more or less the same. Well, that we're pointing back at ourselves too. We're human.
Right.
If we want to be different from them, the real question, and I think the challenge to us is, do we want to be so different that we're branded a heretic?
Hopefully that word is controversial or unorthodox, so to say. But what I meant by that is, I think I also in the kind of the chapter on gatekeeping, I probably cover that too. That groupthink happens in any small business niche a lot. So, I'm in Google Ads, and within the Google Ads, niche, there's totally groupthink. We all love to hate on one tech or the other, but you have to be okay with breaking the mold of what so-called best practice might be. Kind of an interesting, like where I saw this first in my life is my entry into marketing was actually in photojournalism when I was just right out of college. And it's, by the way, it's a it's a terrible industry to go into if you ever want to pay rent, but it's a lot of fun. Um, but it was a lot of fun. I traveled a lot, worked for a lot of nonprofits and stuff all over the world. And one thing I found is that there was a certain old guard, kind of the older guys that had been photographers for decades. And a lot of these guys were awesome, like really cool guys that taught me a lot. And then there were guys that were not awesome. And they were kind of like, they literally thought, and this is in the early 2000s, this was like 2011. At that point, they were literally angry with people who were using digital cameras. This is 2011. Digital cameras had been around since the 90s, and they were still, they were like actually angry. It was ridiculous. I thought it was silly because I had my DSLR is all I could afford. I couldn't afford, a $25,000, Hasselblad. But that to me is kind of like they just saw any digital camera person as a heretic. They were like, oh, you're not a photographer. You're just I don't know what they thought. But all they were doing is they had a kind of a solidified idea in their head of what it meant to be a photographer. And all the young guys suddenly started being way more efficient and going on a lot more projects at a lot lower cost. And it ate into these guys' business and they hated it. And we were heretics. And honestly, I learned to be okay with that.
When we look at that kind of resistance to change, you helped open my eyes in terms of, so change is happening all the time, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the earth is turning, the earth is rotating around or revolving around the sun's moving, everything's moving, mm-hmm. right? And that this imaginary things stay the same status quo that keeps people like film-based photographers wanting to cling to that, is something that you say we will do even when there are disruptive changes. So in the marketing field, like we've had some fairly disruptive changes, like AI is now writing ads. Mm-hmm. PMAX campaigns mm-hmm. are now, changing how all placements and content, construction is done. Meta's done their own, TikTok, the advent of video. These are really working to go against what our old wired human nature does. Mm-hmm. And that we will, even to the point of delusion, want to revert to the way things were done. Yeah. You talk about in Chernobyl, how you got to visit Chernobyl many years after the explosion, but you said that there were people who had grown up prior to the incident, and that even though they'd been pushed out of the exclusion zone, a number of them moved back because that's their house. Mm-hmm. That's the wash basin that they've always, done things. That's the cutting board in the kitchen where they've always prepared their meals. That's the garden they've always, and you're like, you are exposed to radioactivity. So I think that's a perfect example of just how far this type of thinking can lead us unless we shake ourselves up a bit.
Yeah, and you see it in all industries at some point or the other. Some are slower than others, but like one of my favorite topics is I just love space flight. I've always loved space flight. Mm-hmm. And nothing is more like cutting edge and indicative of this than the space launches right now. So many people, like Musk is a super controversial figure for, probably for good reason half the time, but it's like it's just amazing what SpaceX is doing. They put more mass into space now than anybody else combined. And like, what is it, like something like 1 or 2 launches a day or a week? I forget, but
they're getting close to that.
Yeah. It's like to me, that's a very inspiring way of like, he doesn't make a lot of friends because of his, interesting approach to things, but he gets stuff done, or at least Gwen Shotwell gets stuff done. That to me is someone who's a heretic, and maybe that's okay. You know, you don't have to like it, but he gets it done, you know?
Yeah, I think there's that element of risk taking. So he put his PayPal fortune at risk to do this. You point out from Galileo to Luther to Solzhenitsyn to Thoreau, other people, and look at the thread there. They were all willing to risk comfort, reputation, even though if we're not in Thoreau's orbit, even if we were to try to do a little bit of what he did, and I encourage people, I'll have in the show notes, the Thoreau story, that if we're just fiddling around on the internet trying to change our own little corner of how, let's say, digital campaigns are doing, you say, we don't even have the balls to disrupt our own little industry.
Yeah. And, like it can feel a little maybe delusional to compare yourself with, any of those guys. But, at the end of the week, I like to just drink some coffee and, sit in the garage. I'm not doing anything groundbreaking. But if I can't even push some boundaries and make my own industry a little uncomfortable with what I'm doing, and my industry is pretty irrelevant to most of the world, this is not rocket science. This is, if I can't even do that with an inconsequential industry, like, what am I really doing? Am I really a great marketer? I need to be ruffling some feathers. And I'm not saying being a jerk about it, but you just, I got to try some ideas, I don't have to
self-awareness, right? Like, you can't view yourself as the guy coming in on the white Charger, and yet push the pencil around on the desk.
It's kind of like, it's maybe just that self-awareness lets me think, okay, I don't have $1 billion to spend on this idea, but what if I risked enough that it would hurt? What if I could risk $10,000 on this idea? Like, my wife would be very angry at me if I lost $10,000, but it may be worth it for the right idea, right?
I think even it manifesting as a book that you wrote and said, I'm going to put this out in the world regardless of what people think about me. I mean, that is in your own small way, a way to kind of voice that description. Another way, though, that you did point out, and I thought this was a really clear and a kind of an easy one that we could all put into practice, is you ask us to look at our own marketing metrics. We go to conferences, you and I go to many of the same ones, or follow the same folks on social, and they say, your time on page, or your ROAS, or this rate, and this is the benchmark, and are you beating it? And, compared to, like, there's a podcast I follow where they're all HubSpot clients. And so the person, is able to compare them to all the other HubSpot clients that they can see in that instance. And it's like there's some magic in making those metrics turn out perfectly. And you just say, well, have you stopped long enough to ask yourself if those are even the right metrics for that company?
Right. Yeah.
And if they aren't, why do you keep pounding them? Why do you care what they show?
Yeah, that's a good point. And we have a client whose only metrics they care about are impressions. It flies against all best practices. And it hurts me even to work with this account because, I care about, conversions and money, but they literally, that's the purpose of this campaign. They're a larger client and they literally just want impressions. They want eyeballs. But honestly, that's okay. It's okay. It's what they want. It's the purpose of it. So yeah, it's just something, you just got to look at things and be okay, breaking out of those best practices if they're not the best for that client.
Yeah, that's right. And that's a intensely personal thing, but let's say you're coming into a new job or you're a new agency serving a client. Don't just take and reheat what the previous
Yeah.
player did. That I think is a travesty. It would be better even if you try to get some different metrics and midway you realize, you know what,
Hmm.
actually we're not measuring the
Right.
right things. Okay, we'll go back to doing
Yeah.
it their way. But you gave it a shot.
Yeah. And gathered some data and moved on. Yeah.
Right. Because the data is going to show you the way anyway. Okay, Gil, you've had a number of different campaigns that you've touched over the years,
Hmm.
and there are some things that you draw out that these are unorthodox, but you should give them a look. And you said that one of the things that you saw going through the ones that were the most successful was that they were willing to kind of be that outlier, even if the clear way to win wasn't apparent. But when it did take off and they were successful, like they were all set for that. It's like the market shifted their way. They made their brand
Hmm.
represent who they really were, and they weren't so concerned with tilting the brand towards what all the market research said about whether consumers would want it or not.
I think some of that is actually, it comes from the flaw of over quantification, if that's even a word.
Okay,
Um,
sure.
and I see a lot of marketers and agencies, in-house departments, anybody basically fall into the trap of over quantification, which I think has happened a lot in the past 20 years with digital marketing kind of overwhelming traditional marketing. It's
Yeah,
not that it's bad. I make my money by quantifying things, but we
right.
just have to be kind of aware of the limitations that you don't really always even see everything. I think we honestly, as much as we try to, force into metrics, we're seeing 10% of the reality. I know that's kind of vague, but I work like almost solely in Google Ads. It's a very quantifiable, metric oriented space. I love it. It's part of the reason I do like it. You can attribute almost anything. But where it fails some clients at a certain level of size or scale is that you can get pigeonholed into looking at just the cost per click or the cost per acquisition or this or this or this, when in reality sometimes it's just a branding campaign can do a whole lot, just kind of like a TV commercial of old. um, and we've seen some of our clients, they will risk a pretty decent budget on a very unproven kind of branding campaign, like a YouTube pre-roll campaign. And
Right.
amazingly, it like we ran this one campaign. It was a 30-second long video, and we ran it for 30 days right before Christmas. And we spent $31,000 on this one campaign. It was a huge video campaign for this client.
Wow.
And we had been convincing them for a while. It's like, we really need to do it. We don't think the customers really have kind of have your brand, front and foremost. There's a lot of competition in this niche. So we got approval. We ran it. It was a really well done video campaign that they had produced. Amazingly, even though we were just targeting awareness and impressions essentially among their audience segment, they literally made their money back and more from the sales attributable directly to that campaign. I think they sold $32,000 just from that campaign.
Yeah, when it was
And it
not
was,
even
yeah, it
expected
was,
to
we
do
were,
that.
we were assuming worst case, it was money just down the hole. But
Yeah.
not only did the attributed sales, it was, I think, made 32,000 just from that YouTube campaign tracked directly, but like across the site, like they literally doubled their year over year that month before Christmas. How much of that is tied to that campaign, that you truly cannot ever know. But I am convinced it had a lot to do with it.
It sounds like a courageous campaign, and I want your take on it because you do talk about the fact that the internet not only has, ballooned to having everybody on it, but that there has been a centralizing influence among the huge ad platforms. They now command, a very small number of them command 80, 90% of all. And we have in those platforms constantly barrage of recommendations and ways that they're targeting. I'd mentioned Performance Max before, just the fact that they are in a deterministic way, which OGs like you know was not the way that pay-per-click used to be, but they're being rather deterministic. Do you think that even using the platforms and being able to put campaigns like that YouTube pre-roll in, do you think it's harder now than it was before because those platforms and the auctions behind them are nudging you to doing it the way everybody else is doing it?
That's a very good question. And if I actually had the answer, I would have $1 billion to spend on spaceflight. I don't. So I don't even own a rocket. So I have a guess.
Go ahead.
My answer 2 or 3 years ago even would have been drastically different. It has changed a lot. I like PMax now. It works. It almost pains me to say it.
Okay.
But it,
Okay. But you do also sound a note of caution,
Yes.
though, that even if it's not at that layer of the stack, you point out that whether it be our folks that host the CDNs, right, the networks that propagate different media, the hosting companies, domain name authorities, you do say that those are all being pushed together into a very, very concentrated number of players. Some even are a single point of failure.
And you have
and we've got, this is a tough time because we are putting a lot of eggs in this basket. Even if the basket is producing for us, you sound that note of caution.
And you have a very good point in that kind of deterministic, if everybody is advertising on PMax, doesn't that mean I'm doing the same thing? And you're right. That is a huge risk.
Well, and pessimists would say, so now it's just a Google tax.
Yeah.
Right? If I'm selling a product, it's just a tax that's added on.
Honestly, I think that's what we see in something in LSAs or something like that, where you have almost a pay per success.
Even if it's branded. Yep.
And I don't like that necessarily. With Google taking more and more controls away from campaigns, which honestly, that's not just a Google problem, it's almost all of the platforms' problem. We do fall in that trap of, well, we will all be very orthodox advertisers if we keep on using this campaign with less and less buttons, so that it's a huge risk.
Yeah.
At the same time, I do think we might be in a little bit of a golden age with PMax right now where it does work. For now, are we still just the early adopters 2 or 3 years later? I think we might be. This is actually, I'll try to have to find a way to tell this without any revealing information on this campaign we just onboarded. I've never seen anything like this in my life. It is a campaign, a pure PMax campaign created 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
No assets have been added, no customization whatsoever, targeting the entire world, no exclusions. It is as stupid of a campaign as you could possibly think of.
Right.
And this campaign is giving 4,000% ROAS. It blew my mind. And we're looking through it, and we did find in there there's like 60% brand, so there is some brand that it's probably
Right.
sucking away from their organic SEO, but that sort of ROAS, it's like, who cares? So that looking at this
Yeah.
campaign, which it has a lot of problems and does need some help in other ways, but it kind of made me realize, well, sometimes this does work. Like, is just the new orthodox
Yeah.
way? So yeah, that was a little bit of a reality check for me.
It could be. Or there could be elements. I mean, you boil down the two most important parts of marketing. You say that it comes down to brand and
Yeah.
skills. Now, the item with skill, the question is the skill that whoever 3 years ago knew to put their chips on that campaign type? Or, and I'll think more broadly, I think skill actually, maybe we should be ready to make a change when we do notice that black box Performance Max doesn't perform for us. Then we need to be ready. This is one of those, it really messes with your head, because you have to be willing to say, this is algorithmic. I don't know exactly why it's working. I'm going to be upfront about that if I'm, an agency talking to a client. I can never abdicate my responsibility of thinking, what skill would I apply here if this wasn't doing well? What menu? If I had to shift a manual, what levers would I be working?
What's the classic kind of anecdote where the factory has the machine broken down, they call in the specialist, and he flips a switch, charges them $10,000, and they're like, "Wait a second, you just flipped a switch,"
Right.
and he answered like, "Yeah, but that $10,000 is knowing which switch to flip," and that's really just what Google Ads is knowing which to flip and which not to. Still, it may change in the future, but that's still kind of how it is. Maybe.
I think also part of it I think the other part of it that we'll never have inside of that big machine is the ethos of the brand, and telling the story of the brand, and understanding how that story connects to the market. So you say, and I really like how you put it, you still have to be a good storyteller. And sure, you may be handed, a very tight set of assets. You may not have a lot, but you should always be mindful that, look, human beings like you to be clear, concise, relatable, funny, true, authentic. And so I think part of the, I'm going to bang on that pipe, is you are still attending to the way the campaign is set up, but you are making slight changes to keep it in line with those criteria. Because if it's no longer funny or no longer feeling authentic, a human being on the other side of that wonderful machine that's serving the ads, another human being is going to sniff that out.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if I included it in this book, but I know I've definitely written it before. But one of the best professors I ever had an amazing approach to brand. And he told me once, and I'll never forget this, if you don't tell your own story, someone else will tell it for you. And that, I think, really, that's what marketing is. Digital, traditional, whatever. Like, you just have to you have to make sure your story, you're in control of it, of where it's being pushed, of that brand. Because if you don't, someone else is going to make up their mind or tell it for you.
Agreed. And yet you say that the brand is actually what forms in other people's heads and what they say about you. Yeah. So I get what you're saying, but I think instead of us megaphoning, a talk track to them, what we're doing, even in the most subtlest of ways, like where we're going to set a price threshold on when an ad serves, there to set the preconditions for what will come out of their mouth.
Yeah, and
right?
that is almost like I think that really is just being in control of your story, though. Um, whether it's technical
Yep.
or not technical, is just you make a decision for yourself and you stick with it. And if other people are trying to make, are conflicting with it, you just forge ahead, and just ignore them. And
Yeah.
even if say Google tries to switch, your LSAs where you're paying $75 a call and you can't afford that, just don't do it,
Yeah. And like I think about B2B scenarios where you have to imagine those different times in the buying process when the conversation in the prospect's mind, or maybe with their colleagues at the company, is going to focus on a particular thing. Okay, yeah, but does it have these specifications? Or, but
hmm
is it better than the
hmm
competitor's offering? Or, and you have to leave those little breadcrumbs where they'll be found. And if you do it properly, you'll be able to arrange them to be there at the right moments. So the story, just like any story, it has a progression to it. I love pushing back on people when they say, "Oh, it's simple. You just come up with like a tagline. That's your whole story." Like, no, no, we haven't begun the
yeah, yeah,
story. That's like the cover on the
right.
outside of the book.
Yeah,
But take them through what somebody who is now already at the other end, who has gone through the entire customer journey and loves that brand. Okay, so how did they arrive at that heavily
mhm.
ever after? You're just at
Yeah,
once upon a time.
yeah, and at some point, part of your story is this thing costs 19.99, or it
Yeah,
it can be very, very simple. Yeah,
it's not
no,
the
it's
only
just one
part.
aspect of many, even the boring parts. But yeah, you at some point the cover of the book has a price on it. There's a long, boring
That's it.
chapter in the middle. Just tell it all.
When we invest ourselves in things like this, we sometimes want to imagine that we can have our marketing professional side to ourselves, and then another compartment of ourselves that
hmm
is our personal life. You fight this pretty hard. You make the argument that if you're going to get up in the morning and do your thing, you're going to be drifting in
Yeah.
and out of personal things like walking the dog and having the coffee, to work things, but your mind and your overall gestalt, it's never very far from your mind. um, and that means that it's okay to invest some of your own person. I hate it when people, you pointed out one thing you hate. The thing I hate is when people say, let's say they treat somebody badly and they,
Oh,
brush
it's
it
just
off with
business.
saying, "Oh,
I've
it's
heard
nothing
that so many
personal. It's
times. I
just
hate it.
business."
Oh,
Right? And you point out that actually stunts how well somebody
hmm
will do in their career if they take that attitude. Why do you say that?
well, I'm probably a little biased on this because my work honestly is my life. Like I feel like it just really is. I work a lot and I work with my wife but I also love it. So I'm not complaining about that.
Hmm.
But I think at the end of the day, how maybe it's just karma. What you do comes back around. You burn bridges in business and you won't have any more, places to retreat, I think that, I mean, this could get into some ethics, but if you're a person treating people poorly in business and you're okay with that, then honestly, your personal life is just as bad. You're going to treat people poorly personally. You just don't want to admit it. Um, so you're really that's
Yeah.
inauthentic, and you're telling a story that's false when you're in business. Brands do that all
Yeah.
the time.
And I don't think people can keep that up. Yes, admittedly. But I think when it comes to people and marketing, let's face it,
hmm
there's a lot of money on the line, whether it's the spend or an even bigger number, which is the
hmm
anticipated attainment that spend is trying to generate. If people are hiring an agency, if they're hiring an in-house marketer, knowing what makes this person tick, you go out and you meet with them, you have maybe your first chat with them over a coffee. It means something to me if they are treating that server nicely. For the barista, who they don't, owe them anything, but they go out of their way to be nice to them, that'll somewhere in my calculus to hire them. That'll play into it. I'm sure it will, because I'm thinking to myself, there'll be a crisis one day and I will need to reach out to them, or I will need to pick among them and a few other people. Are they the person out of that crowd that's really going to roll their sleeves up and help us weather this storm?
Yeah. It's like, if I have a PPC specialist on a campaign with a client, something goes wrong and we're dealing with something, is that person going to just rip my PP specialist a new one, just like they did with the waiter? Yeah. It's going to happen to me one day.
Yeah, right.
No.
Leopards don't change their spots. You kind of finish off the book with saying, if you zoom out enough, you'll see even that as an era. It seems right now like it's a trend that will continue, but that there are, it's going to give way to the next thing. Tell me a little bit about that last chapter and kind of what your thoughts were. I think you even drifted into how there are myths that point out that after every once in a while, the slate gets swept clean and something else is going to come along.
I think that's just the natural cycle of platforms and media. Newspapers came and went, radio came and went, blogs came and went, apparently, even though I still have a blog. Now everything is in shorts. Everything is in like little 5-second videos. I blink and I miss half the video. So something else will come inevitably. Yeah. I just think if you're a good marketer, which I hope we are, then we'll have that, your eye out for whatever comes next. And I would love to be on the ground floor of that when it happens. I hope it's not TikTok, because I can't handle it. But, maybe what if Facebook goes away? What if Google search goes away? One day it will. I don't know whether it'll be next year or 20 years, but I want to be there for the next thing.
Yeah, and that if you're too invested in the current status quo, even if you were early on it, then you might find yourself like some of those villagers who are drifting back to living near Chernobyl when it's clearly not healthy.
I hope I am not that.
So you are saying we should be prepared ourselves to wipe the slate clean every once in a while, be ready to reinvent ourselves.
If the whole world floods, hopefully we can start over again. Bring a couple farm animals along.
That's true. And even better. And I love that, because mythology. And so, whether you go to Norse myth or you go to Greek and Mesopotamian myth, every single one of them has one of those total rebirth stories. The cycle, it starts off not looking good. There's destruction. There seems to be no hope of rebirth. And then unexpectedly, in a very small corner, there is. And I think that's really important, because I think we get to these junctures in our career where we think it's a dead end.
But I tried to end it on a good note.
I think you did, Gil. As you know, I'm fond of the book, and I think other people should get their hands on it. And if they want to do that, where
grab it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Books A Million or your favorite retailer. It should be there. It's just Unorthodoxy.
Thanks. And to you out there, go use this to get better insights into how you do any aspect of your marketing so that you can make it even better.
Thanks for listening. Follow the show on Twitter @FunnelReboot. If you like what you have heard today, please consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts.